Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Red Bull have revealed their major concerns about their performance at the upcoming weekend's Las Vegas Grand Prix. The track temperatures are set to be the lowest this weekend that they've been at any race so far this season on a car in the Red Bull that has arguably the worst tyre warm-up on the entire grid. That has its benefits as well, but in terms of qualifying performance and over the first few laps of the Grand Prix, it's quite likely Verstappen and Perez might be driving on ice and will have a hard time keeping it out of the wall. This is a major concern for Red Bull this weekend. Does it open the door to another champion? Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. First of all, big news of the day really was this from General Motors confirming, this was rumoured yesterday actually, and the embargo seemingly lifted on this afternoon, that GM are going to register as another power unit manufacturer. This one from 2028. So in 2026, we are going to have, at least according to current expectations, 6 different power unit suppliers. That's quite a lot. From 2028, it's apparently going to be 7. So Mercedes, Ferrari, of course. We've got a Renault, right? Even though, they haven't been so good the last couple of years. Of course, supplying Alpine. Red Bull Powertrains / Ford. That's your 4th. Then we've got Honda making their return as the 5th. Audi as the 6th, which is, well, there's been rumours that maybe Audi might decide to pull out before they've even started. Those have been going around. And then apparently there's going to be a 7th on the grid come 2028 in terms of power unit manufacturers. This is a really big deal because General Motors seem committed to their entry into Formula 1 with Andretti Cadillac. That's the proposal. That's been approved by the FIA, but Formula 1 management don't seem to want to give them a second look. They're kind of forcing their hand here, right? GM are coming in and saying, hey, we're going to make power units and we've applied to do that, we've registered to do it, that's what we're going to do. Formula 1 management can't just sit there and pretend that Andretti doesn't exist. Like, they have to respect this proposal, and clearly the intention is that if Andretti is accepted, as this is a clear indication that GM believe that it will be and intend to make that the actual future that we see, that they will then partner up on the power unit supply side of the equation. So yeah, Andretti say, sure, they're entering in 2025, so that's the plan, although that might not get approved. But when GM come through as a power unit supplier, they will then become, the full PU manufacturer. Now, sure, maybe there's a chance that GM come in, they try and say, all right, yeah, we're going to make this work, we're going to supply Andretti, and it's going to be fantastic. And then after a few years, GM call it a day, Andretti has secured the spot, and they can stay in Formula 1 and, all the benefits that encompasses. So maybe that's part of the plan, but I guess for the meantime, they might still work with Renault or another power unit supplier that was rumoured to be linked to Andretti in the meantime, if they were to get accepted. But clearly a very big intention, and the fact that this was a major announcement due today, that all the embargo lifted this afternoon, and it's definitely a boost to the hopes of Andretti actually becoming a proper 11th team on the Formula 1 grid. Because let's be honest here, Haas are a bit of a joke. Like, they drive around at the back of the grid as the American team. They bring one upgrade all season and it makes their car worse. Now Hulkenberg is saying, put me back to the old spec. Their tyre take is terrible. And sure, there's debates as to whether Andretti Cadillac, the GM proposal, would actually be a competitive team, but at least they've got some racing pedigree, and I'm sure they'd do a better job than Haas. And Ben Sulayem as well of the FIA, it's been interesting to see how the president of the FIA has got very involved and has very clearly a preference on what happens here on the Formula 1 side. He's been very bullish on General Motors, Andretti Cadillac getting a spot on the Formula 1 grid, and has obviously approved it within the FIA themselves. This is a pretty big win for him, actually, given his, given his position. And he goes on to say, delighted with the news that GM have registered as a PU supplier for FIA Formula 1. This is a further endorsement of the PU regulations. The presence of iconic American brands Andretti and GM is good for the sport. So a bit of a win for Mohammed bin Sulayem. Whether Formula 1 management feel the same way, that is another question entirely, but it's definitely a positive to the idea we might get an 11th team in the next couple of seasons, of course targeting still 2025. The engines will then arrive a few years later if this is to be believed. Now, there has been some talk, as I mentioned, about Audi Sauber, whether Audi are actually still going to go for this or whether they're not. Been a bit of a strange story, really, because you wouldn't expect that Audi would say, yep, we're committed, we're building a Formula 1 team, we're taking over Sauber, and then would decide, actually, no, we're not. A couple of, months before things really start to kick up into the next level gear. But Alfa Romeo, of course, part of Sauber, not even sure they're really going to be called Alfa Romeo next year, or soon enough anyway. It's just going to go back to being Sauber, isn't it? Before the Audi thing is meant to happen. They have committed to an all-new Formula 1 car for 2024. Okay, some teams say this every year. They might say the same thing for 2025. The reality is, though, this is the important car. You've had a couple of years now with these ground effect regulations. This car will determine massively what the 2025 car looks like, because most teams in 2025 will be putting all of their efforts towards the new 2026 regulations. So this year's car is very important. Alfa Romeo, Sauber hope to get it right, but it's going to be entirely new, apparently, despite the fact that over the last couple of races, they've done okay. They've looked a bit more promising. But it's just been quite an anonymous season from Bottas and Zhou, really, despite a couple of good results here and there. Now, let's talk about the Las Vegas Grand Prix, because this weekend, one of the big stories is all the potential chaos that may unfold. Is there going to be a challenge to Red Bull? We saw Singapore, always a bit of a tricky track. Singapore can be a bit of a giant slayer. We don't really know what to expect in Las Vegas, but it is a high-speed street circuit with definitely possibilities for chaos. It's obviously being deemed as like the greatest spectacle on earth. Formula 1 are putting a lot into this. They're promoting it themselves, so it's a big money sink for Formula 1 in the immediate term that they expect to pay dividends in the longer term. But they need this weekend to work out for them, Formula 1. It can't go as the Caesars Palace car park Grand Prix did, the last track they did in Las Vegas, which was an absolute shambles, and we don't need to dive into that today. But they need this to be a spectacle, and they need it to actually be entertaining. And to be fair, they wouldn't be much better of endorsement for that than an actual competitive battle at the front of the field. There is, after all, actually a race going on this weekend, rather than just all the razzmatazz of the Las Vegas, opening ceremony on all the celebrities. You guys know how it's going to be. I'm sure you've predicted it in your mind, but I'm looking forward to seeing how it all plays out, to be honest. Now, the track conditions have been another big talking point. It was even mentioned by Ross Bourne that they didn't even really consider the fact that the desert in getting into the winter period is actually pretty cold. That's what happens when you don't really have any clouds, that all of the, maybe it's warm in the day, but all that temperature just evaporates into the sky when there's no cloud cover. So the desert can be very warm, sure, in the summer, but it can also get very cold in the winter. And sure, it's not going to be possibly as cold as we might have thought and initially, mentioned a couple of days ago, but it's still going to be significantly colder than every other race has been so far this season, which is very interesting for Red Bull, because their car, as we've seen pretty much every race this year, has been worse in qualifying than in the Grand Prix. This is in part because the suspension is, a masterclass, clearly, from Adrian Newey and his team, but it does have its pros and its cons. The anti-squat, anti-dive suspension means that it treats its front tyres especially very delicately, the Red Bull. Those front tyres get very nicely into the window around about 4 or 5 laps into the Grand Prix. But in qualifying trim, getting them up to temperature for an actual good hot lap, and in the first 3 laps of a Grand Prix, we've seen it many times this season where Verstappen's been on the back foot for the first few laps, and then he starts to just drive away from the field with better tyre degradation because the car puts less energy into those front tyres. But it does bring downsides in terms of tyre warm-up, and that's really the main reason why the Red Bull isn't half a second clear in qualifying, as quite often it can be in race trim. So this is why Perez says that actually if there's any team that the temperature tyre issue will affect the worst, it might possibly be Red Bull. As he says, this is not something that favours us as a team. We've got to keep it in mind. Now, of course, you don't really know how it's going to go from a simulation perspective. The teams really have no clue what the track surface is like. They don't have any simulations. They pretty much have to turn up and see how it goes to see, okay, how grippy is the track? If it rains, clears away any rubber that's built up, what's that going to be like? It's going to be slippery. It's going to be cold. The tyre compounds are all of, I believe, the softest compounds. So possibility for a 2-stop, but also generally meaning that the tyres are going to be the grippier options of all of them available, which I guess is necessary. But even in the last couple of weekends at the front of the field, we have seen the same type of thing. Perez often kind of struggles to get going in the first couple of laps. He's quite vulnerable at the early part of races over the last few races. And certainly Max Verstappen, this is at the start of the Grand Prix for Brazil, well after the red flag restart, when Norris put him under attack for a couple of laps, even got within, a tenth of him going down into turn 4. And then Max decided, all right, enough's enough, I'm going to drive away. But we saw the same thing occur in Austin as well, just before that, when Hamilton, this was in the sprint, of course, when Hamilton got within half a second, 0.3 of a second of Max in the first couple of laps, and then after that, he just drove away. And sure, the reason why Max is able to just drive away after the first few laps of a Grand Prix is the same reason why he can struggle in the first couple of laps and isn't, the car doesn't look as good in qualifying as it actually is because of the tyre warm-up stuff that we've mentioned that can prove problematic at times, especially when it's kind of cold. Look back to circuits like Australia. That was the Grand Prix where I think Verstappen was on pole there, but he got overtaken by Russell into turn 1 and then overtaken by Hamilton into turn 3, and he was actually behind the two Mercedes for a good few laps there before chaos started to occur, and he still won the race anyway. But that was, all things considered so far this season, one of the colder track temperatures, and it did seem to affect Verstappen off the start. Didn't have as much grip as he wanted. The Mercedes got him. Eventually, he got them back. But in Las Vegas, we might be in a different scenario just because it's even colder than it was in Australia. Looking at the numbers here, Australia was pretty much the coldest track temperatures we've really had so far. Definitely down there, I think it was a bit of an overcast day. But Las Vegas is next level, this is obviously F Stats Analysis puts this together, F Data Analysis on Twitter. And you guys can see that, well, here you go. These are the temperatures for the Grand Prix, mostly in the 20s. Obviously up in Qatar, it was up to 39 average daytime temperature. Very hot Grand Prix there. But Vegas is going to go from what's been some pretty hot few races down to the coldest one of the season by far. He's got this at about 10 degrees. Now, if you look at the Weather Channel, or if you look at look this up right now, it's not actually going to be quite as cold as we might have thought. We're seeing here that nighttime, we're looking at 13 degrees, maybe 10 degrees Celsius, of course, this is on the Saturday night, which is the race day. There is some chance of rain as well, which could wipe away any of the, rubber that's built up on the track to be rubbered in over practice and qualifying. So definitely possible that the Grand Prix is going to be slippery. I think it will be. It's a street track. It's going to be a bit bumpy, I'd imagine, as well. Tricky conditions for the cars, and even if it's not as cold as you might have thought at this time of year, I think it's probably slightly above average for what you might expect these type of temperatures. It's still going to be much colder than it has been before. So does that mean that qualifying for the Red Bull and the first few laps of the Red Bull are going to be a challenge? Possibly yes, even more so than usual. Does it matter in the grand scheme of things though? This is effectively the circuit here. Okay, there's a few tweaks to this, but gives you the rough picture as to where the cars are going and what is around the track. There's a mega long back straight. This is a big DRS zone. This is a big DRS zone. This is a mega straight as well. Cars that have good straight line speed, Verstappen and Perez can probably take it very easy through the corners and still extract a very competitive lap time around here. So I'm not expecting it to affect their qualifying pace too much. What I'm more interested in is lap 1 of the Grand Prix and let's say a red flag restart situation when the tyres might not be in the same window as they'd like to have, and their competitors, the McLarens, maybe even the Mercedes, the Ferraris of the world, might have around the Red Bull. Max could get swallowed up. And also there's the possibility of, let's say it's slippery on the track. It's rained the day before. Max has no tyre temperature because it's freezing there, and the Red Bull doesn't really help in those scenarios. I think they're going to have to be careful to keep it out of the wall. I think this will apply to many drivers. I'm expecting, frankly, some accidents and some incidents. I wouldn't be surprised at all if, turn 1, turn 2, there's guys locking up, people going wide, sliding off the track. Okay, it's not necessarily going to be what we saw in Hungary 2021 with Bottas going bowling, but we might have something a little bit similar. So I think the Red Bull especially will have to be careful for this. If Max can survive and Perez can survive the first couple of corners and get through the first 2 or 3 laps, I think it's probably a foregone conclusion this Grand Prix, especially given the fact that the layouts, it should favour a team like Red Bull quite considerably. But I think there is a reasonable chance that Max could get held up in some sort of incident, which could open the door to another winner, right? In Singapore, Red Bull got things wrong that weekend. And, Vegas could be a similar story depending on what we see. They'll try and find ways, maybe on setup, to try and get more energy into those front tyres. But if it is a concern, Max and Perez might be more vulnerable than most. You might also think, with a track with big straights, that, what about Williams? Can they be very competitive here? Sure, they should be able to be reasonably good. We've seen in races like Spa and Monza that if the Williams can get itself to P8, P9, then they can hold other cars back because their straight line speed is so good. The issue is that let's say you're Albon, you're in P8, you've got a train of 4 or 5 cars behind you, all with DRS. The DRS zones here are very long, and because of the cold temperatures, the air is denser. Therefore, the slipstream effect is more powerful. I think it's going to be, let's say in Spa down the Kemmel Straight, Albon can actually hold off guys behind, or Monza. But here I think it's going to be a bit more of a challenge. Even in Mexico, it's a similar thing because the air temperature is, well, higher, but also the air's less dense because of altitude. So slipstreaming isn't as much of a big deal. It's going to be a big deal here, and there's big straights, big DRS zones. I think it's going to be tough to hold on to a lead in a DRS train, but we'll see. And, the Williams, with the straight line speed that it does have, should at least be optimistic about this particular weekend. Just before we close out, wanted to mention this from Red Bull. We did see the other day rumours that Adrian Newey and co at Red Bull have a design idea that will revolutionise part of the way the aerodynamics are created on the RB20 next season. And even as Pat Monaghan says from Red Bull, that it's not the best idea to just evolve this current car into next year's car without doing anything brand new. And as he goes on to say, it perhaps wouldn't surprise you if I said that it will be an evolution of the current car. So sure, it's going to evolve, but it will be quite foolish to throw the concept away. But equally, we've got to make some progress. We've got to find some lap time. The opposition is on us, and if they do a step, then we'd better have a bigger step. So this is the bit to look at, really, because of course next year's car is going to be in some respects an evolution. It's going to look the same, let's be honest. It's going to be the last couple of cars have looked the same anyway. The livery is going to be the same, regardless of how much they try and hype it up. I'm sure they will try, but they have to evolve parts, and they have to potentially even, revolutionize parts of the car as well. And it sounds like they have a reasonable idea of, well, sure, if the opposition is going to do X, Y, Z, we're going to do this, and it's going to give us even a bigger step, which is, it's quite the scary quote, really, isn't it? Because the opposition, if they do a step, we need a bigger step, which they don't necessarily need a bigger step, do they really? Like, they could have a smaller step than the opposition and still be ahead. But the fact that Red Bull are looking at and talking about a bigger step than even their rivals can accomplish is, makes you wonder what next season might be like as, before it's even begun. But very much intrigued your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.